remarks of the APO Secretary General. It seems there is no sound. Sorry for this issue. We are working on solving it.
Of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, Matthias Corbin, distinguished APO and the OECD panelists, and respected members of the audience. Greetings from Tokyo. It is a great honor to be invited to this webinar marking the launch of the APO-OECD joint publication on investigating the main drivers of productivity growth, a literature review. On behalf of the APO, I appreciate the OECD's effort in the second stage of our collaboration, which resulted in our new publication. The volume resulting from the first stage was titled Towards Improved and Comparable Productivity Statistics, a set of recommendations for statistical policy, and released in March 2021. Our new publication covers a multitude of points important to the APO, particularly in exploring fundamental sources of productivity growth to elevate and accelerate the socio-economic development of our members. A country's productivity performance is central to long-term economic growth and higher living standards, while strong, sustained productivity growth is an important foundation of a resilient economy. Achieving it can be elusive as productivity opportunities are uncertain in nature and timing. As recent trends and patterns show, the contribution of productivity to higher living standards has decreased in most countries. Adverse events such as the global pandemic, which has decelerated growth trend and prospect, weaken not only national productivity performance, but also its drivers. As the pandemic has changed the way we work, countries need to focus on productivity drivers to achieve sustainable, inclusive recovery. In line with APO vision, inclusive, innovation-led productivity growth in Asia and Pacific, and assist members to confirm challenge and to meet evolving expectations, leveraging new drivers of productivity is one of our priorities. New drivers that include innovation, advanced technologies, and digitalization are expected to lead to exponential productivity gains. With the addition of inclusive productivity by expanding outreach and targets, the gains will be broad-based and benefit the entire society. The focus attention and re-emphasis on the main drivers of productivity growth are paramount, and many APO members are at critical critical junctures of progress and transformation toward more productive, advanced economies. This is a very exciting stage of development. However, experiences and studies in other regions has revealed cases of stagnation and the risk of being trapped in the middle income category for those countries that are unable to transition from low skilled, low productivity to high skilled, high productivity sectors. The pandemic has encouraged many firms to adopt digital technologies to continue their businesses, creating more efficiency in their production processes. Reaping the full benefits of digitalization, however, will depend on various transformation and adjustment in business models and practice, work organization, skill composition, and reallocation of resources within and across firms and industries. Digitalization can only increase productivity within firms. Consider these prerequisites carefully. After 6 decades of leading the productivity movement in Asia Pacific, the APO is aware that productivity is more than just an aspiration or simply a catchy phrase or slogan. Productivity must be tangible, measurable, and have visible benefits for organizations, firms, and individuals. This makes the role of policies and institutions more relevant in promoting the drivers of multifactor productivity, MFP, a focus on productivity measurement in this new publication. I am happy to report that APO and OECD were able to summarize the main drivers of productivity growth using the MFP approach in our joint publication. This can serve as a guide for policymakers and administrators in planning and implementing future productivity initiatives. I am grateful to the support of and contributions by the OECD research teams whose insights and foresights enrich the publication. The updated insights and analysis will help reinvigorate productivity post-pandemic and guide sustainable economic recovery. I would like to reiterate my appreciation to OECD Secretary General Korman and OECD research team for making this collaboration successful. I look forward to seeing tangible results based on our efforts and hope that our joint initiative will continue and expand in the years to come. I also hope that everyone attending this webinar finds the presentations and discussion thought-provoking and productive. Thank you.
So, Mr. Secretary General, I see that you are one of the attendees to our webinar today. So let me take this opportunity to thank you for these very nice and comprehensive introductory remarks. So it's clear that the OECD and the OECD share common concerns regarding the productivity slowdown since the mid-2000s and regarding what is required from workers, firms, and policymakers to reap the benefits of digitalization for productivity growth and avoid that it leads to increased inequalities between firms, between countries, between workers. In order to be all on the same page for the discussion, I suggest that we now move to the presentation of the report itself on the main drivers of productivity growth. Let me just remind you that you now have the possibility to enter questions in the chat. These questions may either concern the report and be addressed to the authors, or they may be addressed later on to the panelists. Together with my OECD colleagues, we will select a few questions and I will ask them after the panel discussion. I'm glad to now give the floor to my OECD colleagues, Ashley Ward and Belen Zini, for the presentation of the report. Please, Ashley and Belen.
So I'll just share my screen now. Hopefully that does the job. Can you see my screen, Pierre-Alain?
Yes, that's fine.
Perfect. Okay.
Thanks, Ashley.
So I'd just like to start by thanking once again all those who have joined us today to mark the launch of this latest report. My name's Ashley Ward and I'll be presenting the main thrust and the key findings of the report, together with my colleague Belanzini. I just wanted to start by echoing the openings of our respective Secretary Generals. It has been a pleasure to work together with the APO on this and on the previous report. So this is the second of the two reports that we've produced in collaboration with the APO towards improved productivity measurement and analysis across our member economies. I think we're all very aware that the COVID-19 pandemic has heightened existing concerns around the long-standing fall in productivity growth in many of our economies. And the present report starts with a discussion of the potential impact of COVID-19 on productivity growth, and examines the role of the most important factors influencing multi-factor productivity growth in APO and OECD economies. But some may ask, why should we focus on MFP growth at all? Well, there's a number of reasons to focus on the economic literature analyzing the drivers of MFP rather than other productivity measures. First, MFP, sometimes called total factor productivity or TFP in the literature, is an important contributor to labor productivity growth and therefore to GDP growth. According to the literature, MFP growth has played a key role in the productivity slowdown experienced after the oil shocks of the 1970s, the ICT-driven productivity boom, and most recently, the productivity slowdown observed in many economies. However, MFP growth is most commonly estimated as a residual, which represents that part of output growth that cannot be explained by contributions of labor and capital. And this means that MFP is a multifaceted concept whose developments can be influenced through a wide range of policy levers and institutions. Importantly, the evidence points to a continuous decline of MFP growth in most economies, and in many cases starting even prior to the financial crisis. And the COVID-19 crisis has only compounded these concerns over both the short and the long-term views. So now, to cover those views, I'll hand over to Belan, who will tell us what we know so far about the impact of the COVID-19 crisis.
Thanks, Ashley. Indeed, understanding the impact of the COVID crisis on productivity in the short term is extremely difficult. Still, we can refer to what we have seen happening in the short term. The lockdowns and the mobility restrictions sparked both a supply and a demand shock, as firms couldn't operate fully or effectively, and the consumers reduced their demand due to the mobility restrictions, but also fear of volume losses and rising uncertainties. This has led to both a decline in the output and in the hours worked. As shown in the graph, labor productivity growth in the OECD surged in 2020, in particular in the first half of 2020, as hours worked declined much more than GDP, and then slowed in the second half of 2020 and through 2021. In the APO, instead, the slowdown that in the labor productivity growth that started in 2018 continued also in 2020. However, in the report, you will see that the labor productivity performance differed across countries, probably reflecting differences in job retention schemes, the magnitude and the composition of the fiscal support packages, the economic structure of the economies, but also the extent of digitalization and teleworking prevailing in the economies at the time of the pandemic. Certainly, forthcoming industry data will help to better understand what happened in 2020 and also to monitor what has happened in 2021. Next slide, please. Now, turning to the long term, we can make only an exploratory assessment of the potential impact of the crisis on productivity. The literature suggests some potential effects of a mixed nature. This is with positive and or negative impact on productivity. First, we can expect an acceleration in the take-up of digital technologies. We have seen the pandemic has encouraged many firms to do so already, to continue their business during the lockdowns. Indeed, evidence in East Asia and the Pacific suggests that many firms have increased the use of the digital platforms and adopted digital financial services as well. Second, there are some signs that teleworking is here to stay. And as regards the impact of teleworking on productivity, survey evidence points to a positive impact in OECD countries, but the negative impact in Asian countries. Moving on, there could also be hysteresis effects via human capital, as long periods of unemployment may lead to irreversible losses of human capital, but also through investment, because elevated uncertainties and tightened financial conditions can deter investment in the coming years. In addition, the crisis has encouraged countries to adopt or consider reshoring strategies to reduce their dependence on strategic areas, with the risk of slowing or even reverting the global integration trends and the associated productivity trends. Last but not least, we are yet to fully understand the impact of the massive government support packages and of the potential missing of a generation of startups on productivity. Overall, the long-term impact of the COVID crisis on productivity in the long term will depend on the ability of our economies to balance those positive and negative forces, certainly with the results varying across countries, sectors, and firms. And now I hand back to Ashley to discuss the main drivers of MFP growth.
Thanks, Belen. So against this background, the report reviews the most important drivers of multifactor productivity, which can be broken down into broadly 3 dimensions. So the first are those that boost innovation and experimentation of new knowledge and technologies, including R&D, digitalization, and investment in intangible assets. Second are those that contribute to the diffusion of existing knowledge and technologies, including human capital and public infrastructure. And third are those that facilitate the allocation of resources within or between sectors and firms, such as the competition, globalization, and financial development. In practice, this allocation is somewhat arbitrary, and I think we can all acknowledge that some of these drivers potentially belong in several categories. This core chapter also discusses the importance of good governance and institutions, which you can see at the bottom of the slide, which emerge as a cross-cutting influence across all 3 dimensions here. So I'll start with R&D and digitalization. It's well documented that R&D is a major source of innovation and knowledge accumulation in our economies, and so an important determinant of productivity growth. But measuring R&D remains an important challenge, and there's a wide variety of measures that we found used in the literature, including R&D expenditures, the number of research scientists and engineers, the number of patents requested, and more. So clearly, measurement is an important factor here. Moving on to the second item, digitalization, which can drastically change the way that business is done and households consumed, as we've experienced over the past couple of decades. The literature points to important complementarities between the adoption of digital technologies and other drivers. For instance, it would clearly be hard for a business to embrace new digital technologies without adequately skilled human capital, so education is important there. Digital technologies are also complementary to other forms of intangible assets, such as organizational capital and data, which constitute a social and economic resource for value creation, planning, and decision-making. However, despite their importance, measuring the digital transformation and intangible assets in national statistical systems is far from trivial, which is why it's at the top of the agenda for the international statistical community. So now shifting focus to the diffusion of existing knowledge and technologies, human capital is clearly key. Workers' skills, managerial quality and practices, gender and cultural diversity, all increase the productive capacity of the workforce and facilitate the adoption and diffusion of knowledge and technologies. Human capital plays a complementary role, as we just mentioned, alongside other determinants of MFP growth, in particular, the participation in international trade, FDI, R&D, and digitalization. However, existing measures of human capital fail to capture its complex nature, with increasing measurement efforts over the past decade. So there's recent evidence from the OECD Global Productivity Forum, which points to the relevance of managerial quality and practices, skills, cultural, and gender diversity on productivity. Moving on to public infrastructure, which enables, sustains, and enhances economic activities. However, analysis is limited in the absence of a universally accepted definition of public infrastructure, as the range of assets covered and their scope really varies across the studies that we saw. Some studies refer to only what they call sort of basic or core infrastructure, which includes sort of the obvious, like roads. And others include also so-called social infrastructure, which includes educational or healthcare buildings, for example. And others also point to digital infrastructure, which includes the means of sort of storage and exchange of information and data. So after discussing those factors, I'll now hand back to Belen to discuss those drivers related to the efficient resource allocation and to close the presentation of the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. Another key driver is competition. Indeed, it contributes to productivity improvements by increasing efficiency, lowering market prices, but also bringing newer and better inputs and products. However, new business models fostered by the digitalization and associated to large investment in intangible assets appear to be at the root of recent increases in market concentration, markups, and profits in advanced economies, and also the origin of the so-called superstar firms. Now, these firms build themselves on technical and managerial advantages and scale economies. And in that way, they can contribute to productivity increases in the sector in which they operate, somehow challenging this vision of the competition productivity nexus I was just describing. But they can also collude, and they can find ways to raise barriers to entry, deterring competition. This means that competition is becoming more and more difficult to measure, and so its impact on productivity. Moving on, another driver is globalization that allows firms to access new markets and also facilitate the spillovers across the different economies and firms. Now, the literature finds a positive relationship between international trade and integration in global value chains and productivity, but it's more mixed about the impact of foreign direct investment on productivity, as it appears that this depends on a number of factors, including the infrastructure in the host country, local labor market conditions, among others. Now, with globalization losing momentum, the report stresses the need to improve both the quality and the timeliness of globalization indicators to inform economic policy. Another important driver is financial development. That is a key ingredient to facilitate the reallocation of resources. Now, the literature is very clear. It plays a complementary role, as it appears to multiply or constrain the impact of all other MFP drivers. Moving on, we need to bring to the scene the governance and institutions. Indeed, as we have said before, they act as a cross-cutting factor affecting all other MFP drivers. Indeed, the institutions influence the behavior and interaction across economic actors, but they can also constrain their actions. Most studies highlight the complementary nature of the institutions, as they may intensify or restrain the impact of all other MFP drivers. However, current measures of institutions have serious limitations, as these are typically composite indicators based on subjective perceptions, sometimes not comparable over time, and with potentially rough scoring system. This is why the report calls for caution when using these indicators in empirical analysis, and in particular, when informing economic policy. Now, to conclude, let me share the most important recommendations outlined in the report at the time of conducting productivity analysis. The first one is to account for reverse causality. This is the relationship between MFP growth and each of the MFP drivers happens to be two-way, with the driver affecting MFP growth and vice versa. A second important thing that you have here all the time is the complementarities. So it is important to exploit the spillover across the different MFP drivers in order to reap their full potential. The third thing is their complexity. Indeed, each driver has a complex nature itself. And for this reason, the report presents and recommends to monitor a range of indicators for each of the MFP growth drivers as a way to understand their developments and to fully understand their impact on productivity. And related to the complex nature of each of these drivers, well, we have the statistical challenges. Indeed, the report stresses the need to improve the measurement of some of them, in particular, human capital, public infrastructure, and institutions. but also their timeliness when it comes to indicators on globalization and engagement in global value chains. Last but not least, it is also important to work on international definitions when it comes in particular to the measurement of data and artificial intelligence, so we can ensure the international comparability of the forthcoming data in the future. This is all from us. We hope you will enjoy the reading, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Belen and Ashley. So let me just remind the attendees that they have the possibility to enter questions in the chat regarding the report or the discussion with the panelists. So as you have seen, this report is a review of the main productivity drivers identified in the literature, with a particular emphasis on competition, digitalization, intangible investment, and complementarities between assets. But it's not only a pure academic review of the literature. This report is also very pragmatic and rooted in economic and statistical reality, since it also discusses the impact of COVID-19 on productivity and the key measurement challenges related to each productivity drivers that are discussed in the report. The panel discussion that is now about to start will give us the opportunity to discuss even further the impact of the pandemic and the most pressing data needs for productivity analysis. Let me now briefly introduce our three panelists. So Mr. Zahid is the Deputy Director General of the Malaysia Productivity Corporation, an agency under the Ministry of International Trade and Industry in Malaysia. Mr. Zahid is an expert in the measurement of productivity, in particular in the public sector, as well as regulations and their impact on economic activity. Then Mr. Vu is an associate professor at the National University of Singapore. His research focuses on economic development and digital transformation. Professor Vu is both an academic researcher and an economic advisor to technology companies, international organizations, and governments agencies in many countries. And finally, Mrs. Murugan is the head of the Trade and Productivity Statistics Division at the OECD. Prior joining the OECD Statistics Directorate, she held a number of senior economist positions in the Economics Department and the Trade and Agriculture Directorate of the OECD. She also used to work for the French National Statistical Agency and the European Central Bank. Many thanks to the three of you for being with us today. I suggest that we start with Mr. Zahid and then continue with Professor Vu and Mrs. Murugan. I will proceed in reverse order for the second question. Without further ado, let me ask you the first question, Mr. Zahid. Can you please tell us how the COVID-19 altered your assessment of the key productivity challenges in the short and the long term?
Yeah, thank you, Berat. Thank you, APO and OECD for having Malaysia Productivity Corporation as part of the program today. Our main function is to resolve productivity challenges faced by the business in the area of talent, technology, regulation or institution, industry structure and behavior of workforce at the national, subnational, sectoral and firm levels. During the COVID-19 period, we are more active in collecting data with a more data point and increasing the frequency of identifying new productivity challenges faced by business. To answer your questions, I would like to deliberate on 2 points. First, on MPB, short for Malaysia Productivity Blueprint, and secondly, I will highlight how our approach has shifted because of the pandemic. My first point in assessing the key productivity challenges, MPC, we remain guided by the blueprint. The national blueprint has identified 10 key productivity challenges at the national level, and 43 specific challenges according to subsectors. Yeah? With these challenges, there are initiatives to mitigating them. At the national level, our productivity improvement initiatives are driven by government and with industry support, input, and also involvement. At the sectoral and firm levels, the efforts are led by the private sector with full support from the government. The blueprint identified talent, technology, regulation, industry structure, and behavior of workforce as critically productivity drivers. And these drivers remain relevant pre and post COVID-19, though the nature of key productivity challenges within this area changed significantly. Which brings us to my second point. Let me illustrate this through examples. Under the blueprint, 9 industry-led productivity nexus has been established, covering the main economic subsector, including tourism subsector. One of the productivity challenges addressed in 2019 by the tourism productivity nexus was congestion at the Singapore-Malaysia border. Several policy measures taken to ensure a smooth experience for tourists to enter Malaysia. When COVID-19 happened, the priority has been altered to a different productivity challenge based on information, qualitative and quantitative data given by the industry. As such, the Nexus shifted its focus to addressing the rising operating costs in the hotel industry. If I may summarize, we find ourselves engaging more frequently with the industry players in mitigating COVID-19 impact on productivity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zahid. So you emphasized the very concrete initiatives at sectoral level coordinated by your organization to raise productivity in Malaysia, as well as the specific challenges brought by COVID to the tourism sector in Malaysia, as in many other countries. I will now give the floor to Professor Wu, who is also very much interested in the sectoral impact and on the relocations across sectors triggered by the crisis. Please, Professor. You're still muted.
Thank you, Pierre Allen. It's a great pleasure for me joining you today and listening to excellent report about the driver of productivity. So regarding the challenges facing us in understanding productivity issues from perspective of the COVID pandemic, I see 3 things here. The first one, actually, we have to go beyond efficiency measure to actually capture the issues of resiliencies and evolution. So efficiency so far, it focused mainly for value added divided by productive resources, labor, capital. That's very important one. However, during the COVID time, we see the very important issue in avoiding disruption. And now in the post-COVID time, we try to think about how to recover, bounce back faster and getting stronger from the pandemic. In terms of evolution, we also see a lot of potential for the economy to transform more robustly, more fundamentally from the COVID. So if you try to capture the comprehensive measure of productivity, we should go beyond the just efficiency measure to think about resiliency and evolution. That's the very first assessment I would like to bring up here in our discussion. The second one, actually, you can see the upshore of the adoption of technology. So now actually people feel very comfortable to purchasing online and attending the virtual meeting like this. In the past, it is somehow very difficult and you could not imagine. So now it picked up substantially. And here I would like to emphasize the jump from 0 to 1 rather than from 1 to 5, because it means during the normal time, we may never be able to pick up this kind of technology so fast. So it means definitely under some extreme situation, the embracing of technology somehow much greater than we think. So that I would like to emphasize the push factor here. Quite important in pushing for technology adoption, and in the report we emphasize, innovation and technology diffusion definitely play a very important role in MFP. So definitely that's the second point. The third point, quite interesting. I see the importance of market functioning in terms of promoting productivity. So if economic, socio-economic integration can play a very important role in improving productivity. For example, I look at the case of ASEAN and India. Both economy actually have comparable size of GDP of around 3,500 billion US dollars. And before the COVID, India and ASEAN, actually the gap of growth not so significant, just 0.5% percentage points during the COVID time 2020 and 2021. The gap become 1%, and now the post-COVID, the gap become actually widening at 2 percentage points. So here I would like to emphasize the importance of socio-economic integration in promoting economic growth and productivity. So it also has a powerful implication for ASEAN policymakers in terms of actually fostering economic integration, so that each individual country can enjoy greater growth in productivity and in GDP. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Vu. So your discussion highlighted very well the potential benefits for productivity brought by the crisis, the COVID crisis, because it accelerated the pace of digitalization. But you also highlighted that some countries or regions in Asia benefit more than others from these opportunities. The same is probably true between firms and workers within countries. Let me now turn to Mrs. Morgan. So Annabelle, how has the COVID crisis altered your assessment of the key productivity challenges in the short and the long term?
Thank you, Pierre-Alain. And let me start by saying that I'm really delighted to be a part of this panel and to have this opportunity to discuss with Professor Vu and Mr. Zahid. So I think you raised a very good question. As you know, productivity growth has started to slow down, sometimes even before the financial crisis in many countries. And so when the pandemic occurred, there were some genuine concerns that productivity would be hit even further, which could be very detrimental to well-being in the long term. But the difficulty is that even before the COVID crisis, productivity developments were a puzzle in many economies. Indeed, nobody was able to identify one silver bullet to boost productivity growth. And rather, productivity was, and I think is still seen as a multifaceted concept, which can be examined through different angles. And this is what the reports that we are launching today does. Investment, human capital, barriers to trade and competition, governance all played a key role in shaping productivity developments. But I would argue that the crisis has added another layer of complexity in our understanding of productivity growth and of its drivers. First, there's no consensus in the literature on the impact of crisis or recession in general on productivity. In the long term, there seems to be some evidence that on average across crises, there is no impact, but you do have some negative impact in the case of very severe crisis. But in that case, the magnitude of this impact is really uncertain. Evidence is even scarcer when you look at the short-term impact of crises, which are generally very difficult to estimate using standard approaches. Second, even if there were some evidence from past crises, the COVID crisis is one of a kind, and it's not clear at all we can use past evidence as a benchmark. In addition to be fully global and synchronized, there are two specificities of the COVID crisis that I think we should take into account. First, government responded massively to help firms weather the crisis. So to a large extent, productivity developments in the long term are going to depend on how well those policies have been targeted to illiquid rather than insolvent firms, which could become zombie firms. And this issue is even getting more and more important now as inflation and the energy crisis have increased the risk of firms' bankruptcies. The second specificity of the crisis is that it has accelerated the pace of digitalization and the use of teleworking. So we suspect that digitalization is going to support productivity if the right conditions are in place. But the impact of working from home on productivity in the long term is relatively unknown. And in both cases, there's a need for further investigation on the impact of these new ways of working on productivity. Thank you for your attention. Over to you, Pierre-Alain.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. So in addition to the potential benefits and challenges brought by digitalization, you also highlighted that the long-term effect of government support measures will depend on whether they have been sufficiently targeted and by how much the indebtedness of firms has increased due to these measures. And this clearly adds a layer of risk and uncertainty to the situation that prevailed before the pandemic. In particular, in the current situation where interest rates are rising all over the world. In order to better understand now how we could reduce these uncertainties and develop better economic policies, I suggest that we now move to the second question and discuss the kind of data and statistics that would be most helpful to reduce the uncertainties. As already said, I will now give the floor to our panelists in reverse order as compared to the first question. So, Annabelle, according to you, which data gaps should be filled in priority to help policymakers address the challenges for productivity brought by the crisis?
Thank you again for this question. I would say that unfortunately the list is quite long, and actually the APO OECD report that we are launching today does a very good job in identifying key information gaps. Priorities are certainly going to differ depending on the countries or the area you're looking at. But in my view, there are 4 main data gaps that needs to be filled in priority. The first priority would be to develop international definitions of data flows and artificial intelligence, and more generally to better capture the digital transformation in official statistics. The main reason I'm putting this first is that the way we produce and trade is becoming more and more digital, and this trend is going to continue in the coming years. So we cannot assess the impact of this transformation on productivity without reliable measures and measures that are comparable across countries. Thankfully, there's a number of initiatives that are underway in the context of the revision of the system of national accounts and of balance of payments. We also have the OECD AI principles on which we can leverage on and to get a definition of AI and classify AI systems. We are also about to publish a revised handbook on measuring digital trade across borders, together with the IMF, WTO, and UNCTAD. So all these initiatives should contribute to a better understanding on how the digital transformation is affecting productivity and what policies should be put in place to prevent an increase in the digital gaps between small and large firms, but also between rich and poor regions. My second priority would be to improve the measurement of human capital and of governance, which here I take in a very broad sense, and I include also informality in there. I think those are key drivers of productivity at all levels of economic developments, but I'm not going to expand too much on this because Belen and Ashley already touched upon this issue. The third priority would be to improve the timeliness of data, of productivity data, and of some of its drivers to better monitor the strength of the recovery. This is even more important now as the war in Ukraine and the energy crisis have deteriorated the economic outlook and raised uncertainties. So at the OECD, we are engaging in a series of nowcasting exercises. We are working on improving the timeliness of trading value-added indicators, and we are also planning to nowcast productivity data using a range of different methods. The fourth and last priority would be to increase the granularity of productivity data. In recent years, analysis of productivity have shifted to a more micro dimension at the firm or at the sectoral level. And this is to better identify productivity levels and to better target policies. This is also an area where we are planning to do more work in the coming months with the objective of developing a database of productivity measures on a range of countries broken down by industry. Thank you very much. And back to you, Pierre-Alain.
Thanks again, Annabelle. So you highlighted the need for better official statistics to measure the digital transformation and human capital in our economies, as well as the need for more granular productivity statistics. That is already a rich statistical agenda, but I will now give the floor to Professor Wu to further add to it.
Thank you. Actually, I just add on a few points here. So actually, we learned from the report that actually three broad drivers: productivity includes, innovation and digital transformation. The second one, actually, knowledge diffusion, and the third one, allocation of resources. But I also emphasize here the third driver here, actually the structural change. It means you are trying to move, productive resources from lower to higher productivity activity. So to support, productivity growth, for sure, we have to provide policymakers and firms with robust data on this thing. So far, I see a lot of data in data lake. In digital technology, you can data lake. It means a lot of data, but very little data in, warehouse. It means it can be used for analysis and for decision making. So here, I think OECD, so I'm delighted about the collaboration between OECD team and APO. Definitely is a huge synergy here for us to actually to refine the data we have in individual Asian country, so that you can put together something quite valuable like you have with OECD. So far, I know that APO have a great project led by Professor Nomura at APO. At Keio University, produce an excellent report. I look forward to this report every year, try to come up with some insight to advise policymakers here. But definitely we need a actually comprehensive approach to compile data on annual basis or even quarterly one. So at sector level, for sure, we should have the data very much like what we have for OECD. It is a dream to have this kind of data for Asian country, developing country, so that we can gain very deep insight into what's going on as a sector level and come up with some policy recommendation. The second one, we should actually conduct more frequent survey to capture what is going on with digital transformation and even green transformation now, so that we can actually promote green technology. And the first one, I emphasize the regional integration can foster productivity. So we also should capture, so policymakers should work together. And I know actually tomorrow we have the ASEAN Summit here in Phnom Penh. So definitely we have to promote actually regional integration, because they can produce a lot more productivity for us, and monitoring this dynamics actually can generate a lot of value for individual economies, for the member economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wu. As expected, given your interest in reallocations between sectors and firms to foster productivity growth, you also highlighted the need for sectoral data on inputs and outputs, but also innovative official statistics to
that's right,
shed light on the digitalization of our economies. So the reallocations is an area that Mr. Zahid may want to touch as well. Thanks, Mr. Zahid.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to highlight two key points in responding to the questions. The gap and also our initiative to address the gaps. My first point, yes, we have data points on all drivers at the national level. However, some data gaps in specific areas need to be filled to enable more effective implementation of productivity strategies. I would like to highlight our four main aspects: talent, technology, regulation, and behavioral data. At the national level, we have access to this data. They are available, yet at the sub-national and sectoral level, Data in the area mentioned are limited, but more at the firm and enterprise level. We acknowledge this inadequacy, and we initiated strategies to bridge the gap. Let me take you to the second point. Some initiative by us to bridge, if not close, the gap altogether. First approach by building the required data. For example, on the technology, we developed the data index at the sub-national level and digital roadmap for the sectoral and firm level. This give more data and information on a sub-national digital gap and which area require digital technology adoption to boost productivity. In filling in the gap on behavioral data, we mandated to spearhead the implementation of behavioral insight in the policy making. We believe that if we understand how people make choice, human behavioral pattern and their root cause, we can make better policies, increase conformity, and reduce regulatory compliance costs. Secondly, to minimize the data gap, we implement the experimentation approach. This approach has reduced the time taken from 24 months to 10 months in obtaining construction permit for manufacturing plant. With the experimentation, we're able to capture many data points for better policy making. Some of the data we have compiled are compliant cost saving, job opportunities, revenue generated to the government, and productivity improvement. Using these models as an evidence, we are able to convince other sub-regional offices to adopt the same strategy. In conclusion, inclusive data lead to more effective productivity implementation strategy and their implementation. This need to be looked into the all level where productivity matters at national, sub-national, sectoral, and firm level. With liquid data, we can advise and influence policy makers based on evidence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zahid. So consistently with what the other panelists already highlighted, you highlighted the need for more granular data, in particular for regional or state level data. Professor Wu, I see that you have raised your hand. You may want to add something.
Yeah, because actually Mr. Zahid pointed out a very interesting issue related to subnational data, because I see huge benefit from providing, provinces or state level their analysis. Because in Vietnam, for example, we observe the competitiveness of the actually 63 provinces of the country, and when they give policymakers at provincial level, they are aware a lot about what's going on with the provinces, and competition among provinces become very productive. They try to improve themselves, productivity, whatever. So subnational data become very important, very, very productive and very powerful, and actually make the national lead a lot better the variation across the country, and also promote actually the convergence across provinces. That's wonderful point. I just want to echo my support for Mr. Zahid's point. Very practical one.
Thank you very much, Professor. So I'm also very conscious of time. At this point, we're running a bit behind schedule due to the technical difficulties we have faced at the opening of the webinar. But still, I would like to keep some minutes for at least one question. So it's the question I'm going to ask is directed to the authors of the report. But after Belen has had the chance to answer, I will also give the floor to the panelists who may want to follow up on this important question. So, Belen, when you presented the report, you mentioned that evidence points to an increase in worker productivity from teleworking in OECD countries, but a negative impact in Asia, according to a few studies that have been published lately. What can explain this?
Okay, thank you, Piralan, for that question. Okay, let me start by saying that the capacity or the ability to telework depends on many things. The IT infrastructure of the country, the skills, the IT skills of the people, but also managerial culture towards teleworking, and certainty at the time of the pandemic, the stringency of the lockdowns. That said, okay, the impact of teleworking and productivity could be positive if we think about, for example, working more autonomously or maybe reducing the time of commuting, so that improves somehow the workers' well-being. But on the negative side, we see that coordination, communication, but also knowledge spillovers from face-to-face interaction may diminish. And when you look at the scarce, and I say a scarce evidence in Asia that is cited in the report, these studies rely on a survey of a large IT company in India and also on a firm survey, an employee survey in Japan. And they found that at the time of the pandemic, working from home implied in India something like 10 to 20% lower productivity than usual, let's say working from the usual place. And in Japan, it was around 20, 30%. Now, both papers we have point to the higher costs of communication and coordination, and also some problems with networking. You lose the benefits from networking and from face-to-face interaction, and this seems to explain that difference in the productivity of workers when teleworking. So it seems they have increased the hours work, but not that much their output. So I hope that replies the question, but I would like to highlight the evidence is still scarce, and more evidence it's important at the time of deciding teleworking policies.
Would our panelists like to follow up on this question on the efficiency and the impact of teleworking in Asia, especially as compared to what has been observed in OECD countries? I see Annabelle has raised her hand. Please, Annabelle.
Thank you, Pierre-Alain. I would just like to echo what Belen just said in finishing, that we are really at the beginning of looking at the impact of this type of impacts, and especially as far as I can see, most of the studies that we've looked that exist at the moment rely on survey data. Basically, you ask employers or employees what they think their productivity has done in just after the COVID crisis. So there is also a dimension of subjectivity here that could also explain the difference that we see between the regions. Thank you.
Thank you, Annabelle. Yes, indeed, the data sources are very important to reach a conclusion on the impact of teleworking. Mr. Zahid, you have raised your hand as well.
Yeah, thank you. Malaysia, we participated also in this study, and we facilitate MPC. We facilitate the data collection in 2020. We're working closely with OECD. We agree with the finding of the survey, and we also agree with the advantages highlighted by practicing teleworking. Now we are observing 5 companies in banking, petrochemicals, and call center industry, which these companies are practicing teleworking during the COVID until now. What interests me, one of the company operate in 2 locations, and they stopped teleworking in their other economy because of difficulty to coordinate and workforce behavior. So on policy measures, we are happy to inform that next year we will nudge CEO to adopt the teleworking through campaign, sharing of teleworking practices, and a seminar and outreach program. Thank you.
Thank you for this information that will necessarily enrich our understanding of the impact of teleworking. Professor Wu, up to you, please.
Yeah, I just actually would like to give a piece of example to show that actually should have a variation in terms of assessing the productivity from work from home. So to actually related to an AI company here in Singapore, I observed. So for most people, if you can work from home, whatever, very interesting, they're very productive. However, for some cases, client force them to have to be in their office to serve them. They do not actually trust in the cyber security issue, whatever. So it's very difficult for the company to come to the client office to work, and actually the cost the productivity to go down. So, for example, some banks in KL, for example, force them to go there, but they cannot afford to go there easily. So during the COVID time, it had problem. But I do believe that work from home in the post-COVID time will be very productive and substantially improve productivity, because this day people can attract people not only work from home, but work from anywhere. So definitely improve the learning, knowledge sharing, innovation, whatever, on the driver of your productivity is stronger with work from distance. So that's my point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very true that the short-term and long-term effects of teleworking can be different, and more research is needed to shed light on this impact. So, unfortunately, it's already time to close this webinar. By way of short conclusion, I would like to say that our discussion today has highlighted how important it is to continue investigating the drivers and productivity. And we just mentioned the impact of teleworking as an example. It's obvious that the COVID crisis has brought with it new challenges in our understanding of productivity developments, such as the long-term impact of teleworking, the impact of the crisis on reallocations between sectors and firms, and the impact of digitalization. But no good research and no good economic policy would be feasible without good data and statistics. Therefore, we have also highlighted some key data gaps today, among which innovative statistics to track digitalization at a granular level, statistics on intangible capital, but also more granular and timely, very basic statistics on investment and labor productivity, which are still lagging. Before closing this event, I would like to thank all of those who attended the webinar today, and in particular, Belen and Ashley, who summarized the report, our three panelists, Mr. Zahid, Professor Wu, and Mrs. Murugan, and the Secretary Generals of the Asian Productivity Organization and the OECD, who kindly accepted to provide introductory remarks for this event and emphasize the importance of our collaboration. I wish all of you a very good rest of the day, and thank you again for attending this webinar. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Everybody.
you.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.